Hi, good morning, everyone. So while the poll's there and you're deciding which of those boxes to tick, I'm Kirsten Roberts, and you've also got Claire King on screen today, and we're part of the Frith Energy, Waste and Sustainability team. So thank you for joining us. This is the first of our 2021 Green Breakfast webinars. If you don't already know, we ran a series over the last couple of years, and last year's were primarily around EVs and EV infrastructure. If that's something you're also interested in, then please visit our website, and you'll find all the materials from those speakers there, together with recordings and also a risk matrix to help you if you're thinking on engaging in an EV project. But today's about sustainability. We've got three great speakers, and I absolutely promise by the end of this hour, you will know everything you need to know about sustainability, ESG, how to implement a sustainability plan, merge it with your business plan, and what your investors and shareholders are looking for. So with that promise in mind, over to Dan Cooke, who's going to be our first speaker.
Great, thank you, Kirsten, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks to Frith for inviting me. So my job this morning is to give an introduction to sustainability, and I'll focus on three things quickly in 10 minutes. Why you should care, or whether you should care, what you should know in terms of the context and drivers, and what you should do. I've been asked to stimulate a little bit of comment and debate as we go forward, so these are posers rather than a definitive view of sustainability. As an introduction to myself, I have spent the best part of the last 3 years as head of sustainability for the FTSE 100 Pennon Group, and spent a long time before that working in regulatory and sustainability roles as part of that operation with Viridor. I've been recently trading as ESG in the UK, and I'm now trying my hand in landscape management aspects of sustainability as a manager of an area of outstanding natural beauty. But I'm also the chairman of the Chartered Institute of Waste Management, so have a fairly broad view of the issues that we're going to touch upon. Next slide, please. So my starter for 10, sustainability, who cares and why should we? And I guess the answer to that is, again, there isn't a definitive one, but for example, who cares about sustainability? Your customers do, or a good proportion of them. Your investors certainly do, and we'll hear more about that, but sustainability and green investment is becoming a key determinant in investment decisions. Your regulators will certainly care about aspects of sustainability. Your government, whether it's local, national, and indeed global governments, have a keen eye on matters of sustainability, and especially around climate change, as I'll touch upon a little bit more. And perhaps most importantly, your employees at business level, a good and increasing proportion of them will care deeply about sustainability matters. And of course, on an individual level, our families certainly care about these matters too. So I guess the answer is, who cares? You should. Next slide, please. So what are the drivers for change, the context of sustainability that we're currently facing? Again, this isn't a definitive list, but it is a start of a 10. And some of the key drivers, firstly and foremost, and especially in the context of the COP26 event coming up at Glasgow later this year, climate change and net zero carbon is one of the absolute key drivers for change in this area. And I'll come back to that in the next slide. Tcfd, for those of you not familiar, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures and Green Investment, which I've already mentioned, and I'm not going to steal the thunder of later speakers, but it is increasingly a core criteria for investment decisions one way or another. Demographics and customer demand. Demographics, if you speak to millennials or Gen Z, they have a very different perspective on matters around sustainability than perhaps some older generations. And if you're interested in retaining and recruiting the sharpest talent to your businesses, having a progressive and proactive and clear view on sustainability will undoubtedly help in the recruitment of some of that sharp talent. Energy trends. I know Freeths and this group have a good proportion of energy related businesses, so I won't go into too much detail here, but the increasing trends and regulatory and financial levers around energy and the drive to renewable energy, whether that's business, household or transport energy, will be familiar to us and aren't going to get any less complicated or any less of a driver. In terms of waste resources and the circular economy, again, a key driver, whether you produce large amounts of waste in a production process or whether you are a service level business, there are, again, some very key and fairly radical measures coming down the track in the Environment Bill, which will bring that home and make us all more aware of the need to recycle more and drive towards greater resource efficiency and a more circular economy. Health and safety and regulatory compliance, often the basic starting point for any approach with regards to the S under ESG, the social elements of any good company's management and governance, making sure your employees, suppliers, site visitors, etc., go home safe and well, and increasingly the well-being of our employees. And regulatory compliance, this basic starting point, but going beyond compliance is often the starting point for discussions around sustainability in businesses. Technology and disruptive models, again, many businesses, if not arguably all businesses, are affected by new developments under technology and staying abreast of them, but making sure we take advantage of the opportunities, whether it's in energy efficiency, etc., and looking at disruptive models of doing business will help going into the next bullet point with our own business's resilience. And again, innovation in businesses, taking the opportunities to do things better, to reduce impacts or improve the benefits of individual companies and business activities, a key driver for change. And of course, there is the money side of it, the cash side of it, which is worth following. There are opportunities here to gain competitive advantage by taking a clear and progressive view and approach to sustainability within businesses large and small. And of course, there is the other side of that coin. If we don't, if companies get left behind as new regulation comes down the track, then again, you will lose that competitive edge. Next slide, please. So back to the top one on that list. The one that's probably top of the agenda will be, in terms of news, business agendas for some time to come, and especially as we get up to COP later in the year. I thought I'd use this quote from Martyn Kenny, the former governor of the Bank of England, and these are from the Wreath lectures that he delivered only a matter of a few weeks ago. Net zero is not a slogan, but an imperative of climate physics. And he went on to say, to achieve net zero, we must address 3 challenges: engineering, political and financial. And that power of 3, E, S and G, or engineering, political and financial aspects of any environmental material sustainability matter are worth bearing in mind. It's also, as well as quotes from Martyn Kenny, it's worth, you may have noticed that others are interested in this space as well. So Bill Gates, for example, a man who has changed the world in business terms, has recently published a book with the title How to Avoid a Climate Disaster. Unsurprisingly, he has quite a strong emphasis on the vital role of technology and engineering and the need to divert funding for new technologies to address climate change. In the review of that book, Gates's book, ex-Prime Minister Gordon Brown has laid out 4 things we can expect from Glasgow COP26. Firstly, globally coordinated financial stimulus for post-COVID recovery with a Green New Deal at its heart, delivering environmental infrastructure and the jobs that will come with it. Secondly, new corporate laws ensuring that companies disclose their carbon footprints, adopt weighted accounting, impact-weighted accounting, and publish transition plans to net zero. There will be a threshold on the scale of business that will be required of, but it's coming. Third, we should advance the cause of carbon pricing, ending effectively fossil fuel subsidies. And fourth, we should agree to a boost to nature-based solutions, from reforestation to better land use and green climate funds that incentivize climate mitigation and adaptation. So this stuff is real. a major change is coming. And a good sustainability strategy ensures your company or sector is well prepared for and to be part of that positive change. Next slide, please. Definitions probably at this stage aren't crucially important, but these are just a few taken from online lexico, the dictionaries. The ability to be maintained at a certain rate or level, sustainability in general, sustainability of economic growth, and perhaps the one at the bottom, the most commonly and widely acknowledged and accepted one, sustainable development being development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs, from the Brundtland Report. Next slide, please. So where do we start with this stuff if we haven't already? A couple of useful check-ins. Hopefully most people on the call will be aware of or will have heard of the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, or Global Goals. There are 17 of them as laid out here. And it's really a good starting point to have a look at those goals, understand them, and each of them have targets, their own targets and KPIs for your business to consider. But it's worth having a look at those and working out which are the most materially relevant to your business. Where can you have both reduced impact if you're having adverse impacts or challenges, and where can you maximize the positive impact your individual businesses or collective and collaborative businesses can realize. And then again, the theme of 3, E, S and G, always a useful starting point to measure your impacts and work out how you can drive positive change for competitive advantage across your business activities. Next, and I think last slide, please. And it would be remiss of me not to mention some of the work that I've personally been involved with, but to emphasize the importance of, as we progress and as we consider matters of sustainability, the usefulness of benchmarking and case studies. And here I give an example of Pennon's sustainability strategy. They set out a strategy for 10 years with their own company purpose or vision at the heart of it, and then identifying the three most important areas to the business under the areas of E, S and G. Each of those sustainability focus areas had its clear objectives, targets, and then detailed internal KPIs, and that enabled clear and consistent reporting externally against their performance in those key areas. The finishing point I'd make here is also consider the importance of communication and having clarity of purpose around your sustainability programs for both internal understanding and engagement, and of course external communication and engagement with your key audiences, including, possibly most importantly, your employees and your investors. That's my food for thought. That's my start of a 10. I think we now go into another poll before I hand over to Martyn to go into some of the practicalities. I think everybody can read on the screen the question, and we have about 30 seconds to get your votes in to make them count.
Thank you very much for that, Dan. And our next speaker is Dr. Martyn Kenny, Director of Sustainability at Tarmac.
Thank you. Morning, everyone. I'm Martyn Kenny, Sustainability Director for Tarmac. Before lockdown, I was on a Eurostar to London, and I got chatting to the person next to me. He was travelling from Sweden to start a new job and was asking about how to get across London, how to use the tube, that sort of thing. And as the conversation went on, he said he'd been on trains from Sweden for the last 24 hours. So naturally I said, well, why didn't you fly? It would have only taken you a couple of hours. And he said, I'd be too ashamed. He said, I'd be too ashamed to be responsible for the carbon emissions for the flight. And this might seem surprising, but flight shaming is actually a thing now in some countries. Have the next slide, please. So the concept of sustainability isn't new, but like the guy on the train, over the last 18 months, there's been a sea change in public awareness and focus on sustainability. And this awareness is actually driving an increased expectation onto businesses from employees, from customers, from communities, and from policymakers, as Dan explained. We're seeing government introduce ever more ambitious targets like achieving net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 and introducing new policies to deliver on these targets like the ban on petrol and diesel cars from 2030. And these measures are kind of directly impacting our business and indeed the markets we supply, so that now in the construction sector, sustainability is a critical part of winning new business, and a very big part of our turnover at Tarmac is with customers and clients that have specific sustainability requirements. So Dan's described what sustainability is, but what should your business do about it? Well, a sustainability strategy can help you to prioritise the issues, to set targets and set some actions to focus on the things that create most value for you as a business and for society at large. And so I'm going to share some thoughts about how to develop a sustainability strategy, which I hope will be helpful to you and may lead into some interesting questions later. So the process might seem quite daunting at first. After all, sustainability covers environmental, social and economic performance across the whole life cycle, from the things you buy as a business to the products you produce and to how they perform in life and what happens at the end of life. So pretty much everything you do as a business. So where do you start, and is it even worth bothering? Well, I'd say it's no longer a choice. Not only is it the right thing to do morally and ethically, when it comes down to it, sustainability is about managing business risk, it's about managing costs, and it's about winning more business. It's actually part of running a good business. On the slide, you'll see a curve. This is a maturity curve, and typically businesses follow this maturity curve. They'll start with simple regulatory compliance, and next they'll begin to meet obligations by doing the things that customers, communities, employees insist they do. Then they might look at operational resource efficiency, setting targets to reduce things like energy, waste and water, mainly with a focus on cost saving. Then they might move on to using sustainability to drive growth and innovation. So that's kind of building sustainability into product design or commercial offers to help you win more business. And the most sophisticated companies, though, use sustainability to drive their whole purpose, to create value and impact. And that's where sustainability is fully embedded into the business strategy. It's used to promote the brand, it's used to engage employees, it's used to attract talent, drive efficiency, win business, create value. It's usually embedded at all levels of the business and informs all decision making. So it's actually up to each business to decide what it's ready for, which level it wants to get to, and by when. But that maturity curve kind of gives you an idea of the way businesses can progress. Next slide, please. So an important first step in developing a strategy is to define the purpose of your business. So Tarmac is part of CRH. We're the largest construction materials company in the world. In the UK, we've got 8,000 people working at over 400 operating sites spread across the length and breadth of the country. We're the largest producer of aggregates, asphalt, concrete, cement, lime, mortars, screeds, building products, road construction and maintenance services. So you could think about Tarmac as a business that extracts minerals and processes them into construction products. Next slide, please. But actually, our purpose is much bigger than that. Purpose is about the positive contribution your business makes to the world and how it can address some of the challenges the world faces. It's more than just about profit, although profit is, of course, very important. It's about the wider value you create. Now, businesses are only good at people who want to work for them, and people want to work for businesses that do the right thing and have a clear sense of purpose. And it's especially important for the current generation. So Tarmac's purpose is actually, we're building our future. That's everyone's future. We're helping to build the homes, schools, hospitals, workplaces, transport, clean water, sanitation, renewable energy, all the things on which we rely and which are essential for quality of life. But we want to do this in a way that allows that infrastructure to be created in the most sustainable way. So create fantastic communities, which are great places to live and work, where we help to make lives better and we create prosperity for all. And building our future is also about how we help our people to thrive, how we build talent and careers, both for our own employees and for the communities around us, and how we can help them realise their full potential. So hopefully you can see that thinking about your purpose actually makes you think bigger than just your own operations. It helps you consider the wider influence of your business, and it's a great start to developing a sustainability strategy. Next slide, please. So having established a purpose, the next step is to identify your list of sustainability and risks and opportunities for your business. And the temptation is just to focus on operational impacts, and that's often where people start, but I think it's quite important to look at the wider impacts by taking a whole life approach. So you need to identify the positive and the negative environmental, social and economic impacts of your business at each stage of the life cycle, from the things you buy, through your operations and production, through your transport, how your products or services perform during use, and what happens to them at the end of life. Okay, you need to consider the risks and opportunities across this life cycle, both now and look at those coming at you in the future. Next slide, please. So to really understand your risks and opportunities, you need to think about it from a business perspective, but you also need to understand what your key stakeholders think, what their views are, expectations, what they'll demand of you in the future. You may even consider setting up a sustainability panel using external experts, because this is a great way to help challenge and guide the business. It's quite a commitment, but Tarmac's done it, and it's actually proved really useful to me and our board. Next slide, please. So having looked at all the positive and negative risks and opportunities over the whole life cycle of your business, you've gathered views from your business, views from your stakeholders, you end up with usually a very long list of risks and opportunities. Now, you can't work on all of these, so you need to prioritize them in some way, and a materiality analysis is a good way to do this. So the materiality analysis, you rank the risks and opportunities according to their importance for the business against their importance for stakeholders. And all the issues that come out in the top right-hand corner are the most important strategic issues to focus on. And this process is a great way, to engage employees and other stakeholders in developing your strategy, but it allows you to kind of prioritize the most important things. Next slide, please. So once you've got your priorities, it's usually, as Dan showed for his business, and you can see on the slide here for Tarmac, it's great to build a kind of framework, because this really helps you to communicate your strategy to others. So at Tarmac, we've got 8 key priorities, and these are grouped under 3 main themes: people, planet, solutions. So people are the things that we're doing to make Tarmac a great place to work by being inclusive, supporting our employees to realise their potential, and all the things that we're doing to have a positive impact on the communities around us. Planet is about the things we're doing to enhance the environmental performance of our business and to leave a legacy we're proud of for future generations. And solutions is all the innovations, the products and services that we create to help our customers build more sustainably. Next slide, please. So having established the priorities, the next step is to decide what actions and targets you're going to set on each of them in order to reduce your risks and benefit from the opportunities you've identified. So your ambition depends on where you want to be on the maturity curve. It depends on what your stakeholders expect. You've got to take into account what's coming at you in the future, what will create most value for your business, for your customers, and others. So to set targets, it's important that you first understand your baseline, where you are today, and don't underestimate that. That can take quite a bit of time to set up systems to collect the data and information to understand that. But then you can set targets from bottom up by basing them on measures you can implement incrementally, or you can set your targets top down by setting really stretching targets that kind of surprise the business and galvanize action. You can use a road mapping approach to set your targets. This is a way of plotting out the steps and investment needed to get from where you are today to where you want to be. And you can include on the roadmap various scenarios. So for example, what happens if you do nothing? What happens if I completely ignore economics and invest in every available technology? And then work out what actually is the best pathway between those extremes for me, what makes most sense in terms of strategy and investment. And of course, in doing all of that and looking at your targets, don't forget to consider the resources you'll need to deliver them. So in developing the actions and targets, it's important to make a connection between the initiatives you're going to take and the business benefits that they bring. And basically, you need to build a business case for each one, looking at risk management, looking at costs, looking at winning business. And this is crucial because it's really important for senior managers and others in the business to understand that business case. And without their support, introducing sustainability can be pretty difficult. So Tarmac itself sets big long-term ambitions for each of its priorities, and it helps us to communicate where we're aiming to go as a business and build enthusiasm behind that. But we back up these ambitions with shorter term targets and actions to ensure that we make progress each year. So on the slide, I don't know whether you can read it very clearly, but you can see some of the examples of our achievements. And by setting these ambitious targets backed up by specific actions, we've achieved a huge amount. As you can see, we've been able to use 41 million tonnes of other people's waste as our raw materials and fuels. We've reduced our carbon by 23% per unit of product, etc. I won't go through the whole list, but you can see I'm quite proud of what we've achieved. It really has added value to the business, but there's loads more that we've identified that we want to do. So next slide, please. So finally, in amongst all the strategy, targets, actions, it's easy to forget that at the end of the day, this is all about people. You can have the most beautiful strategy in the world, but nothing will happen without getting employees at all levels on board and taking action. So Dan mentioned it, communication is absolutely key. You need key influence across your business to understand your strategy and talk about it. It needs to be embedded in your internal communications, and it should become just part of how we do things here. Sustainability is a great way to communicate externally with your customers and others and build your brand and reputation. So you need to review, report on your performance. You need to share success stories. Definitely don't make it about the sustainability team. You need to use other people in the business as examples to highlight the great work that they're doing. Look for opportunities to collaborate outside your business with your supply chain and customers. My experience has shown that this creates huge value. And most importantly, make a start. Get some early wins, and that'll soon bring support from within your business. So finally, parting message is really to remember that your sustainability strategy is about doing the right thing. It's also about good business sense. It's about the bottom line and long-term success. And it's about managing your business risks, managing your costs, and winning business. So thanks for your time. I look forward to your questions later. And I think we should now see another question for you to consider. So the question is, what are your barriers to putting a sustainability strategy in place?
Thank you very much, Martyn. That was brilliant. So you should have, as Martyn says, you should have the poll question in front of you. I'll just give you 30 seconds to complete that one. And then we're going to hand over to our last speaker today, Jamie Pickman from Ricardo, who's going to talk to you, amongst other things, about what your investors are going to be looking for in terms of ESG and sustainability. Jamie?
Yeah, good morning. Thank you, Kirsten. Thank you for the invitation this morning. If you just go on to the next slide, please, Tom. Thanks. I'll just leave this little graphic with you while I introduce myself. So I'm sustainability and circular economy consultant at Ricardo Energy and Environment, and have been helping corporates for over 20 years now, and it's been a really interesting journey, and really good, I think, to hear from Dan in the introduction. He was given quite a tough ask there in terms of what is sustainability and is it important, but I think he did a great job in saying that sustainability now is fundamental. It's fundamental to our survival, and it's fundamental to businesses that operate within that society. And Martyn did a really good job of just, I think, demonstrating the value of a good sustainability strategy. And I'll mention later on that I've just published a blog. I spent a few months of last year interviewing some of the top sustainability practitioners across the UK, and I think next time I'd quite like to interview you, Martyn, if that's all right, because we definitely covered a lot of these similar aspects. What I will cover today is really what's changing and what has changed in the market over the last few years, and significantly in the last year, that's really driving significant change within how businesses operate. Next slide, please. So just a quick introduction to Ricardo. We are a global environmental engineering consultancy, and really trying to set our mission to try and solve some of the world's biggest environmental and sustainability problems across transport, energy, scarce natural resources. We operate in over 20 countries, employees of about 3,500, and growing. And I think it's growing because sustainability is becoming such a fundamental issue. Next slide, please. And I was just reminded at the top there, Martyn, when you said about your contacting the train from Sweden, and it just reminded me that we've got a colleague who just joined us from IKEA, actually, was head of procurement, sustainable procurement at IKEA, and he's stuck in Sweden still, and has been here for 2 months because he can't get back. So he's having another problem, but it's due to COVID rather than anything else, unfortunately. But what I wanted to cover here, and I mentioned what is changing, what are we seeing in the market that's creating, I think, a really big shift within the market. And it's this acceptance now and this understanding that sustainability is just not about your impact as a business on the environment, the right hand side of this diagram. It's fundamentally about how you can perform as a business in a changing environment, and that's the financial. It's the understanding the impact of climate on your business, and the impact the climate will have in society. And this is bringing in a real whole new set of stakeholders for businesses, which are the investors, insurance companies and banks, because they are now looking very, very closely at the businesses they are investing in, not because they're profitable and they're making enough money, which was really the case, over the last 50 or so years, but whether they will actually have a business model that will survive in the next 10. So they're looking really closely at their investments. And just highlighted here, and Dan kindly introduced it for me earlier, is this aspect of Tcfd, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, and this is having a fundamental impact on how businesses are having to look at themselves, how they're having to look at their markets, and how investors are looking at them. Next slide, please. So just a little bit of background to Tcfd. We're familiar with the COP, the Convention of Parties, but back in COP21 in 2015, I think it was, in Paris, Mark Carney and Michael Bloomberg launched this new task force, and nobody really knew much about it. But as I mentioned, this was a task force on climate-related financial disclosures, and its whole remit is to try and improve the consistency of how businesses and funds and investment institutions are reporting on their investments or on their operations. It's really just taking greenwashing head on, because it's now not a nice to have for a business, it's fundamentally important to how a business operates. And this is having a sort of a trickle effect down through the supply chains, and I'll come on that later on. So you might not have to report against Tcfd as a mandatory requirement for FTSE 100 and premier listed companies this year, but by 2025 it's going to become mandatory for all listed organisations in the UK. And we're already seeing it in Europe. Just because we're out of Europe, it doesn't mean that we're not affected, but they've got similar pieces of legislation through the Green Deal, which is now becoming mandatory reporting requirement. Next slide, please. So what this has created, Tcfd, in this much closer look at businesses and how businesses will perform in a changing climate, has created the perfect storm. We've now got investors who really historically were giving a cursory glance at how a business was performing in terms of sustainability, they were much more concerned around the financial return on their investment. What they are now realising, and have done for a while, but it's really now coming to a serious impact in decision making, is that their return on investment is now fundamentally linked to sustainability and how that business will perform, both in a changing climate, but just also in terms of a changing environment where we've got much greater focus on plastics, much greater focus on any sort of environmental pollution. And so investors are now looking at the businesses that are investing in. And Tcfd, because it's, you know, addressing some of the biggest financial institutions which are investing in some of the biggest businesses, these businesses are then looking down their supply chain, because they realise that actually their impacts go way beyond their own footprint and will trickle down through their supply chain. So SMEs, you know, who are the engine of the economy, if you like, are now being impacted both directly from investors and shareholders if they have them, also from their clients and customers through the supply chain. And interestingly now, they're being really looked at by their employees. And as both Dan and Martyn mentioned, employees are now becoming a very strong voice within organisations. You know, we'll call it the Greta Thunberg effect, David Attenborough effect. They're becoming much more knowledgeable around the organisations or about the organisations they work in. Next slide, please. And I just wanted to share this slide. We manage a large SME energy efficiency programme in Scotland, largest, I think, single environmental programme in Europe. We provide over 1,000 audits, energy efficiency audits to SMEs in Scotland each year, run lots of events and training programmes. And we had an event, a webinar last week, and I just wanted to include this slide because it really struck me, because I've been, let's say, for 20 years doing these types of events and then running these sort of polls. And this was a poll that we ran, as I say, last week. And it really struck me just in terms of how the way in which businesses are looking at themselves has changed over the last 15, 20 years. 20 years ago, when we ran similar polls, it was cost at the top and regulation. And this is now flipped. And the biggest pressure coming certainly from SMEs in terms of needing to reduce their carbon footprint is coming from employees, you know, which is really positive to see, but it does show you now how the impact of cost is now becoming less of an issue. Next slide, please, Tom. So just in summary of this, I think what we are seeing now from a business perspective and a corporate perspective is that they're being looked at in a much more serious way from investors, from stakeholders, from employees. And what does this mean? Well, it means businesses are now having to really take a good look at their role in society, at their vision, their purpose, how they're performing in that supply chain, in that value chain. And a really important part of that is just understanding your impact and understanding, you know, where your hotspots are as an organisation. And if you go into the next slide, please, this is where it becomes, I think, quite interesting for organisations, because they no longer just have to look after their own operations. And as you look at to develop net zero projects or carbon reduction, decarbonisation projects within your business, you start to become familiar with the scopes. And, you know, scope 1 and 2 will be very familiar. That's the majority of decarbonisation strategies will include scopes 1 and 2. And these are generally the emissions that come from your production of your products or services, direct sort of emissions. But that's not where your impact on society stops. You've got to look upstream at your scope 3 emissions. These are the raw materials you use, you buy, any pre-processing that's conducted before the raw materials or the products come to your operation. Then once you make the product, you know, your responsibility doesn't just stop when you sell that product. You now have an overall responsibility for how that product is distributed, how it's stored, how that product is used, and then how that product is disposed of. And Martyn mentioned just this life cycle assessment approach, and this is absolutely fundamental to how we start to measure and assess our impact as a business on the environment. And your emissions are now, you know, you're responsible for these emissions across your whole value chain. And this is one of the key aspects we're looking at as a consultancy, is that there's lots of net zero targets have been issued by businesses. We're starting to be employed to have a good look at some of these net zero targets. Are they credible? Are they realistic? And do they actually count the carbon that they should be counting? And this is, I think, going to be one of the key areas as investors and stakeholders and consumers are really looking at some of our biggest corporates to understand which ones are really taking it seriously, which ones are just, you know, putting out a net zero target to 2050 or 2045, so far away we don't care. But having a little bit of critique of some of these plans is now becoming quite an important part that we're playing as consultants. Next slide, please. And I'll just bring back to the iceberg here, and I think we're generally quite aware that the iceberg is 20% on top and 80% down below. We'll just have the next slide, please, Tom. What we find when we're going and reviewing some of these net zero strategies is that a general rule of thumb is that 80% of an organisation's emissions will be coming from the scope 3 emissions, upstream and downstream. And it will vary on the different types of organisations, but the key message here is that, you know, it's not sufficient just to look at your own direct emissions. You have to be going much further and making the right decisions around your design of products, around the raw materials that you use. Are they rare earth elements? Could you substitute that material for something else? Can recycling of the raw material? And this is really becoming a key area of decision making for businesses as they now need to reduce these upstream and downstream. It's having decisions in terms of eco-design of products, making products more energy efficient if they're producing electronic goods. And next slide. And this is just really a summary of an indication of how the scope 3 emissions alter for businesses. So automotive, yep, very resource intensive, use lots of steel, aluminium, rubber, glass. So you can see that the use of purchased goods is high, but it's actually the use of the sold products that's extremely high for automotive, because it's the petrochemicals that they use, the cars when they burn when they're in use. That's what's having an impact on the automotive sector's carbon emissions. So a big drive to move to electric vehicles, big drive to move to much more low carbon sources of propulsion. And then just comparing with the services sector, where actually their use of products is low because they're selling services, generally a low impact, but they're really having to look at their use of purchased goods and services. And I think for the audience we have today, many of which are SMEs, many of which may be service sectors, you know, we were thinking, well, what can we do other than our offices? Well, it's really looking at those goods and services that you procure. That's an area that you can definitely take action. Next slide, please. Are we doing okay for time, Kirsten? Because Martyn covered quite a lot of this, but I just felt it was useful just to share, because just looking at some of the polls that we've had, there's a general interest in sustainability and developing a strategy, which is really good. But just looking at some of the answers, it's the challenge of getting started. What do you do? How do you make your strategy fit for the future? And I mentioned earlier that I spent some of last year interviewing some of the UK's sort of leading sustainability professionals, just to understand how do you make sure your strategy is fit for the future. That was sort of the exam question. And I summarised all of the interviews into these 7 steps, which I'll just share with you very briefly. If these slides are shared, or we can send a link to the blog, because it does just summarise, I think, quite nicely the most important things that you need to do. And very grateful for Martyn's insight, because what he said resonated with the findings that I have, which isn't a great surprise. But a key part is knowing where you are in terms of this maturity, in terms of sustainability maturity. It's really important. And what we're hearing from our discussions is just establishing the baseline, taking a snapshot of where you are now, understand your organisation and where your impacts are. And you can do a materiality assessment to do that. You can start to just look at your emissions and understand where you have impact as an organisation. And I think importantly, one of the key messages is also look back before you look forward. Have a look at where you've had successes in terms of sustainability, why you had those successes. Was it because you had a good action plan, you had buy-in, you had a senior sponsor within the organisation? All of these things are really important. Focus on what matters in the organisation. So Martyn mentioned materiality assessment, really good place to start. What we are hearing is that also don't try and do too much. Don't work in 5 or 6 different targets or KPIs at once. Try and focus on a few and do them well. Much better doing that than you are trying too many and doing too many not very well. Gather the right data, really important. You need to be able to measure your impact along the way. I think what's good about that is you start to show progress, and then you feed that progress back to stakeholders. It starts to gain some momentum within the organisation, and that's really, really important, giving some feedback on the progress. And I'm really pleased that Martyn really picked up on this, was the invest in the process, not just the goal. setting the goal is the easy bit. What's actually really difficult is getting a good action plan in place, getting the sponsorship, understanding who the leader is, making sure that it's not just giving lip service within the organisation, but it's a target that's reviewed regularly, the progress is reviewed regularly, and the effectiveness of the teams that are put in place are reviewed as well. Keep it action orientated. You know, you're far better with a really good action plan and targets than you are with a really nice flashy looking strategy. You know, look at the actions that you need to do, understand how those actions could actually be embedded within existing processes within your organisation. You might not need to invent something new. Health and safety is a good example, where there's lots of good processes already there that you can utilise. And a really nice one is don't look for perfection. I think from some of the polls that we've seen today that people are not really understanding where to start. My view in all of this is just get started. Start somewhere, start to make progress. You know, don't let perfection get in the way of progress. It's much more important you start the journey than you wait until you try and have something perfect, because there is no such thing as a perfect plan in my view. And just finally, just report well. You know, as I say, we're mentioning investors are looking very, very closely at organisations. What we're finding now is for the bigger investors looking at some of the bigger corporates, they're no longer asking investor questionnaires now. They're actually using artificial intelligence, data mining. So they're just going across reports, websites, sustainability strategy statements. They want to see what's published by the organisation, and that's how they'll start to assess them. So make sure you're telling a good story, a positive story. Because, you know, lots of stakeholders will be looking at you know, what you're saying about your organisation and what you're saying is important. So just 7, I think, quite nicely summarised aspects that you can look at when you're doing your strategy. Or strategy is maybe too grand a word sometimes, certainly for SMEs, but putting policies in place, plans in place. So yeah, please have a read, and any questions, I'm very happy to help. You'll see if you go onto our website, we're actually offering a sort of a health check for organisations who just want to pick up the phone and have a chat, and just trying to understand how they can get on the journey. And myself and my team are very, very happy to do that. Thank you. And I think I will pass on to Claire King now.
Thanks so much, Jamie. I think we have one last poll question, is that right? But let me just say a quick thank you to Jamie, Dan and Martyn. We are going to have time for some Q&A, so take the opportunity now. If you haven't already typed a question into the Q&A box, do that now. We've had a few questions in advance of the session, and we'll try and cover as many of those as we can now. But just quickly before we get into the Q&A, you may be thinking, what is a law firm's role in all of this? And it's a valid question. We're not claiming to be sustainability consultants here, but what we can help you with, once you've spoken to the experts like Jamie and started to formulate a sustainability plan, we can help in the implementation of that strategy. We have lots of experience in clean energy, both electricity and heat. That might be installing solar panels, that might be installing battery storage, which helps to facilitate renewable energy. It might simply be procuring green energy, and we certainly look at a lot of energy supply contracts to check they are genuinely green rather than just greenwashed. We do a lot of work in low emission vehicles as well, particularly electric vehicles. We've been looking a lot at electric vehicle charging infrastructure. So if you are thinking about installing EV chargers for your workforce, for your fleets, for your customers, do get in touch. We've got plenty of experience there. I'll now hand over to Kirsten, who'll comment, who is our waste expert, and will comment on the waste side of things and then bring us into the Q&A.
Yes, Dan mentioned at the beginning, he's a president in waiting of the waste industry body, the Chartered Institution of Waste Management, CIWM, and I'm part of that as well. Looking at waste as a resource. So waste isn't just something to pay somebody to take away. I think, as Martyn mentioned, you can use waste. You know, people are using it as fuel, but something that's waste to somebody else can be reused. And we're used to dealing with contracts around all of those arrangements. That's waste as a resource. And also, if you're looking at reducing your waste generally, reusing or recycling your waste, we can help you with those arrangements on a contractual footing. We're used to doing that. Claire, I think that's back to you.
Sure, and just final comment on this slide is what we're seeing a lot is in the use of sustainability clauses in your standard contracts. So a lot of our speakers covered how you need to look at your supply chain, the inputs into your business as well as the outputs. There's now a whole raft of standard drafting that we can drop into contracts fairly easily. So to the extent that you would like to look into that, do give us a shout and we can talk you through that.
I think I'll just jump in there. So I've just started seeing, literally in the last few weeks, contracts where where customers are putting obligations on suppliers to inform them about their use of carbon, reduce electricity use, and sort of a continuous improvement style clause where the customer is saying to the supplier, help us with our sustainability plans, but putting that in as a contractual obligation. So I think we're going to see more and more of that. I think we're determined to finish on time for all of you, but we do have a few questions that have been raised, and I'll just pick these out. The first one is clearly for Martyn. Martyn mentioned a 23% reduction in carbon per unit and said this has really added value to the business. How do you measure the value? Is this a measurable financial contribution to profits?
Yeah, there's three immediate areas that spring to mind. So we have, I think I mentioned, 400 operating units, and some of those are very energy intensive, some of them are not very energy intensive, but each of those sites we assign a set a target each year, and we use ISO 50001, which is energy management system, and as part of that we identify energy saving opportunities each year for each site. Now alongside that energy target, you can directly convert that into a financial saving. Now I was very careful in my presentation to talk about managing costs rather than saving costs, because often what we face as businesses is the rising cost of energy, and that's an important thing to consider in your risk. So when you're calculating the financial benefit, you can look at not only what you've saved, but what that additional cost of energy, as the price of energy increases, what that would be as well. And we know as we move towards net zero, energy is inevitably going to become more and more expensive. So that's one way, is directly looking at what your targets have set and what you save on your operations. Another area is we participate in emissions trading scheme through some of our bigger operations, bigger energy using operations. So we have a direct cost of carbon on our business. So we have to report on our emissions and surrender allowances equivalent to what we've emitted in terms of CO2. So again, by reducing those emissions, we get a direct financial benefit. But I know that that's not relevant to all companies. And the third area is in the market. So we're seeing, it was mentioned about contracts, we're seeing a lot of contracts now, particularly on major projects that have specific demands in terms of sustainability and carbon performance, and we can gain a benefit from reducing carbon in our operations, reducing carbon in our products, in terms of our ability to win those contracts. Are people actively paying more directly for carbon? It's very difficult to say, but in terms of some of the bids that we put together, we know we're not necessarily always the cheapest, but we are winning contracts on the back of our sustainability performance. That's all I can say. So there's a number of ways to measure it.
Thank you. Another question, I'm not sure which of our panelists would be best to take this one. What sort of accreditations or certifications are available to businesses who want to demonstrate their sustainability green credentials? And this is in the context of a quote that 40% of green claims made online could be misleading to consumers. So I'm not sure who can pick up that one about accreditations and certifications.
I can have a quick stab at it. I can't give any specific examples, but one way I've dealt with it when I've been working for the big corporations in the past, and indeed talking to smaller businesses, several do the same, is there is the opportunity to commission independent assistance to help you with that assurance process, and there are some experts and specific companies out there who will do that. They can advise you on specific accreditation or certification for different sectors, but also will take that independent view and will provide, if it's in reporting point of view, it's like your assurance statement, and they can provide an assurance statement for the public domain and for your customers and suppliers to put into the public domain on your strategy as well itself. We found that process, and it's a bit like Martyn and his sustainability panel, for example. If you can also have a panel of independent experts who will assist you, they will provide both the internal scrutiny and the external assurance. So that's one way of approaching that. Thank you.
And I can see that one of our attendees has also posted an answer in the chat function, so thank you to that person as well. And I think we've just got time for one last question, really. We've been asked, is it likely that we'll have to report Scope 3 emissions in the foreseeable future? Jamie, I don't know if you're best placed to pick that one up.
Yeah, happy to. Yeah, thank you. Yes, it is. And just also to respond to the previous question, that a number of the sort of assurance schemes or standards, if you like, sustainability standards, will be requiring organisations to make sure they're reporting against Scope 1, 2 and 3. So that will now become a standard requirement for the larger organisations, and some of the standard setting boards require that anyway. I think one of the good areas to think about in terms of net zero are the science-based targets. And what we certainly recommend is if you are looking to set a net zero target, then they should be using science-based targets, or at least aligned to science-based targets. And what they do is set a standard set of rules in terms of how organisations do it. If more than 40% of your emissions are Scope 3, then you need to include Scope 3 emissions in your net zero target. So it starts to create a bit of a benchmark and some consistency across reporting. As soon as a number of the larger organisations are having to report on Scope 3 emissions, that requirement then trickles down through to the SMEs and to the suppliers. And as part of that, they will start to ask questions around your Scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions. It depends how serious the sort of the top tier organisation wants to take this, whether they're going to specify you need to include your Scope 3. But generally, we are seeing it as just good practice now that you include Scope 1, 2 and 3. Whether it's going to be a mandatory requirement just yet, I think we're a little bit off because it's quite hard to do for the smaller organisations. But you'll certainly be being asked for that in some of these questionnaires that are coming from your supplier contracts that Kirsten mentioned earlier, that to supply goods and services to these larger organisations, you'll start to have to report your carbon footprint, and that would more sooner rather than later start to involve Scope 3 emissions. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So I'd just like to say thank you to all of our speakers today. Very informative. For those of you who've attended, we'll be sending all attendees a pack after probably early next week, which will include slides, the results of the poll questions and answers to all the questions, because we haven't had time to go through all of them this morning. So once again, thank you very much for attending, and thank you to all of our speakers, and have a good rest of day and a good weekend. Thank you.